Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Today we've got somebody really exciting that I've been waiting for all week to talk with. Professor Anthony DiMaggio. He is a university associate professor at Lehigh University. He's written 9 books. He's a sociologist. He's a political scientist. He's a little bit of everything. He's a watcher and an analyzer. He's written some books like Rising Fascism in America, It Can Happen Here, which is his latest. Rebellion in America. He's got The Rise of the Tea Party, Political Power in America, Selling War, Selling Hope. All great topics that are hardly touched by most people. Check that out. He also writes for Counterpunch, which is a website out there with lots of great journalists doing fantastic stuff. Professor DiMaggio, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm excited. I'm an excitable boy, and I got one of my favorite guests today because we're going to talk about propaganda and manipulation.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So I'll start off just by asking you this. How did you get started with this sort of interest and this kind of eye that you have for human behavior mixed with politics?
Well, I was a punk rocker from back in the 90s, and I was very anti-establishment. So the idea of studying like propaganda, social movements, like progressive stuff like that was right in the wheelhouse of something so countercultural. So I brought all that into academia, and then I realized pretty quickly that it wasn't really in line with the mainstream of what social scientists like to do. So I've had to sort of balance surviving that kind of academy with being who I am. So it's been an interesting sort of 20 years.
Yeah. You tell those other professors, I'll come to your house. I'll spray paint you. Yeah. Well, it's good to hear because I also have my punk roots, and that's those people with that background have always had that objective eye for authority, and I think that's crucial. So that's good to hear. So this latest book you have, Rising Fascism in America, this is a big deal because I think we're all seeing it, but we're all trying to kind of put our thumb on what's going on. And you're one of the only people that I've heard really put your finger on it. And so, so they've been for, I don't know how far back propaganda goes, but it goes back for as long as you can imagine. But the most famous propaganda probably is the 20th century. And it's changed quite a bit in that time. So in your opinion, what has the medium of propaganda, how has it evolved in that time? Maybe like 150 years or so. And what's the best way? What's the best recipe for propaganda? What's the most effective? How does it work in a nutshell?
Sure. So, if you look at the history of this, I teach a whole class on propaganda and the history of modern propaganda. I think that probably it would be most accurate to say that if we're talking about Western societies, this is commonly traced back to like World War I, the United Kingdom, and the United States. They were really the pioneers of modern propaganda. You had people like Edward Bernays, the Committee for Public Information, which was designated to sell World War I to people through the use of fear, anti-German propaganda. And so, people have this notion that they think of the Nazis or something, right? Oh, the Nazis propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, Adolf Hitler. Okay, yeah, but, Bernays, he was a PR guy. He worked to sell World War I through this committee I mentioned. And then he went to work for the private industry after, selling widgets, products, right? Mass consumerism and using propaganda. And he literally wrote the book on propaganda. It's called Propaganda. So, this is the dude who's sort of the father of the modern public relations industry, modern advertising, mass consumerism. And so, Goebbels ran with this stuff and Hitler, but Bernays was his inspiration. He had him in his propaganda library as one of the sort of forefathers of this stuff. So, there are different types of propaganda, right? It depends on what kind of country you're talking about. You have authoritarian propaganda of the Nazi style. And then you've got, I would put in quotes, democratic propaganda, because it's not all that democratic, right? But it happens in societies that pride themselves as being democratic. And so, this stuff is the best way I've been able to explain it to my students is that it comes in waves. I mean, you've got during periods of war, you tend to have a lot of a fever for war and propaganda, and people don't raise questions because it's considered a time of crisis. Post 9/11 would be a good example. You know, the Cold War era with McCarthyism, World War I is another good example. So a lot of it's like really been concentrated, the study of propaganda around wars. And more recently, we seem to be entering what I would call another wave of propaganda, which is this idea that we're in a post-truth society today. Right? Anything goes. Anybody can say whatever they want, believe whatever they want, as long as you yell loud enough and you're passionate enough. And this is where it's very dangerous, because when you're talking about within the sort of Trumpian movement here, right? Like he's subscribing to things like QAnon, which is very authoritarian, anti-Semitic. And well, also they think things that are factually like absurd, right? Like the Democrats are demonic pedophiles who drink the blood of children, and they're in league with the deep states and Hollywood to destroy America. And Donald Trump is going to ride in on his horse and save us all and execute them in public and hang them from the streetlights. And, you believe anything you want, right? This is half of the Republican Party was QAnon in 2020. At the height of QAnon, these polls showed that pretty clearly. So this is a real crisis today, right? Like this post-truth era we've entered, and we have this just enormous rise of conspiracy theories about election fraud, QAnon. Is Obama really, a secret Kenyan, not a citizen? Does he want to murder your grandparents with death panels, with healthcare reform? Climate change isn't real, and on and on.
So on a basic level, like, what do you think is the primitive instinct that drives people towards conspiracy theories like that, or fake news?
I had a feeling you were going to ask that. Don't ask me why, but I've been researching conspiracy, so it just came into my head. It doesn't seem to be one particular thing that makes people go toward conspiracies, but there's actually a number of things that are really interesting that help to explain this. This is sort of how reality works. Like, it's very rare to ever find a monocausal explanation for anything. To have like one thing that really just accounts for it. What we know with conspiracies is that there's a list of a couple of things. On the one hand, you've got like institutional actors that are stoking paranoia. The Republican Party under Trump has become very conspiratorial. Right-wing media that support him have done that. Social media have served as a real hotbed for the Wild West of information, right? Without much regulation. So they've been doing it, or at least allowing people to do it without much accountability. Outside of that, we see that there's like a certain kind of profile for people, right? Like people who are poorly educated, they don't have a lot of information literacy to be able to detect the difference between like a legitimate source and not. People who are insecure and feel the need to be special and to project that they're special and know more than other people, that kind of profile, they really fall into conspiracies quite a bit. Sometimes people of color and disadvantaged groups that have been treated very badly by society and government, so they're more likely to believe the worst in government. And also people with mental illness. We have to be honest about it. A lot of people who, like Alex Jones, come off as pretty blatantly mentally ill. InfoWars and the kind of stuff that he pushes. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. Some of it's very personal and psychological, and some of it's very structural. When you look at like the media, social media, right-wing media, and political leaders who use media to get out their conspiracy messages.
I mean, so much for the idea of truth is stranger than fiction, or more entertaining than fiction, because fiction is always apparently more entertaining. And we see this with clickbait or any kind of stuff like that, where humans instinctively flock towards the most radical and most insane story, even if it's probably not true. That's why we had the Bat Boy and the National Enquirer and things like this exist. Sure.
I mean, with QAnon, you're talking about the most exotic of the exotic, right? Like, you can't make this stuff up. Apparently somebody did make it up, but it would have been very hard for me to sort of think that people would have come up with this before it actually happened. It was really surreal.
What's the etymology of the information? Like, is there a tap where it all comes from? Is there a website where it's just leaked? Where do they get this stuff? Facebook?
Yeah, there were a lot of personalities, influencers on Facebook before they got deplatformed after January 6th who were doing this. Twitter, the Republican Party, like, people don't know this because they don't pay close enough attention, unfortunately, but like Donald Trump has retweeted QAnon accounts more than 150 times.
Wow.
In the last 2 to 3 years. Yeah. And so how do you accidentally retweet QAnon 150 times? You don't, right?
Well, they just so happen to be in line with whatever that you're trying to do, and maybe you just accidentally. But the QAnon started on its own, but then merged with Donald Trump when apparently at some point they found that their interests were aligned and whatever. But what I'm guessing is that somebody that's a psychologist, sociologist, is working at the RNC or any of these places and trying to figure out how it makes us tick. And now with the help of internet data, they know exactly what we're thinking more than ever before. Like you'd say these, who are the guys that work on advertising in New York? Madison Avenue guys.
Yeah, Madison Avenue, yeah.
They have so much data points on us now that it's impossible for us not to be herded one direction or the other. And now politicians are using this data. And so we don't have anywhere to hide. But somebody somewhere in that organization said, hey, these conspiracy theories, they go real well with the politics and the people or the demographic that you're going for.
Sure. I mean, we live in the era of big data collection, right? Facebook is collecting constantly information sharing with other companies. These political leaders aren't stupid. They can read the writing on the wall. They can see where, the trend, right? In terms of the rise of some of these conspiracies, they get covered early on in the news. People start talking about them. Someone like Donald Trump can see very clearly that this is something he could manipulate because, well, like they love him, right? He's like the deity for QAnon. They treat him like a quasi-godlike figure. Who is going to come back and impose himself and rule as a king and can do no wrong. So, if anything, he's a very savvy, shrewd operator, right? And so he can sort of figure out that this is a large group of people that he can draw on and cultivate, right?
Yeah. But ultimately, what do you think is his goal? Is money or?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a big part of it. I mean, obviously he worships money, but also fame, right? He's always been sort of a glutton for fame. And what could be more famous than the president of the United States? You get constantly put at the center of attention. So like when you're someone who's that rich, someone who's a billionaire, even if he has radically overstated his wealth, he does have a lot of money. What else is there after the money? It's being the center of everything, right? So there's a term psychologists have for that. It's like malignant narcissism.
Interesting.
So, he fits that profile.
Nice. Would you argue that Elon Musk fits the profile as well?
Well, I don't know him personally, but he does seem to crave that attention that Twitter comes along with, right? To be a trendsetter in terms of ideas, and he wants to own Twitter, apparently. He proposed to buy it again. I don't know that he quite reaches the level of a Donald Trump malignant narcissist. I don't know anyone who does. That's a really rare error. But certainly he does have that kind of narcissism where it's not just enough to have money. He's got to be at the center of attention. I think that's the case with a lot of these tech sort of billionaire philanthropist types, right? Entrepreneurs.
Yeah. So you have the difference between CEOs who really are obscure and nobody knows quite who they are, and they like to keep it that way. But then Elon Musk goes out of his way to have a big mouth. And, he's doing certain things. I think, okay, whatever, that's nice. But on the flip side, like we were talking before, technology for me, it doesn't add anything but abstractions on our life that make it more complicated. And it doesn't really ever quite solve some of the problems humans have philosophically. So in that way, I don't give a rat's ass about the guy, But I wonder about this obsession with not only do you have to be extremely rich and extremely powerful, but you have to be in the limelight, all the time. And is that why he plays so well to this certain demographic of people, because they are the same?
I think so. I think that one of the biggest reasons that people gave, I remember looking at the Gallup polling when Trump was running, that said that one of the biggest reasons people liked him is because they thought he was a successful businessman. Well, there's a lot of successful businessmen and people who have made money. Most of members of Congress are white collar business type professionals, right? But he's something different than that. Like he's a special kind of businessman who is like a decadent style wealth, or at least he presents himself as having decadent wealth. So I really do believe that that's a big part of the cult of personality with Donald Trump. It's not just that he's wealthy. Ted Cruz has money. Marco Rubio has money. George W. Bush had money, but they weren't that kind of demagogue like this guy is. So it's the idea that people worship decadent wealth, like that there's no limits on how big you can become in terms of like your name, the prestige. And that's something that Donald Trump really accelerated at over decades of marketing himself, right? Through The Apprentice and through all types of garbage products that most of them weren't successful, but they were very successful at getting his name out there, right? Yeah. Whether it's Trump Steaks or University or whatever.
But the guy still has the cadence of like a pro wrestler.
that plays into it. That's even better because these people think like, oh, I've heard them say this, people who are supporters, that he came from humble origins and made his own money. And it's like, are you high? He inherited his money. He inherited this money, and if he would have done nothing more than take that money and invest it in the S&P 500, he would be more wealthy than he is today. There's been research on it.
Yeah.
Like, he was not a self-made blue-collar dude who worked at the post office and squirreled away his money and made his first $100,000 and invested in something great and got rich. Like, that's not who he is. That's just an image, right?
Yeah.
Of him, the WWF-style commoner guy.
Well, yeah. Who was his dad? His dad was like a slumlord or something.
Yeah, he was a real estate mogul. He inherited his money from a real estate mogul who, did it in a not very nice way when you talk about his investing in questionable, ethical ways.
Self-made man. Okay. Whatever you say, Chief. Well, I wanted to go back because I don't really know your expertise on Madison Avenue stuff, but and I'll just tell you briefly. I saw this documentary where fast food restaurants and food, people in the food industry, they hire these teams to go out and figure out how we tick, and they use lots of data points. They're using MRI machines in some cases to see how our brain reacts to different smells and different colors when we're in the store and things like this. Do you think that that's just as egregious as like political propaganda?
Well, it's a different type. I mean, they're servicing a different interest. They're servicing corporate power and profits, right? But these two things have a common genesis. Edward Bernays is the best example of it because he came from a background of government propaganda, and then he switched over to Madison Avenue propaganda. And so, at the end of the day, I think when we talk about propaganda in, quote, democratic societies, what these different forms have in common is the idea of manipulation on the most basic level. Like, if you talk to people who study propaganda, they will come up with a lot of different facets of propaganda. You could refer to, like, Madison Avenue manipulation of emotion, subconscious emotions. This is the Bernaysian stuff. And you're sort of getting into that when you talk about, like, the biology of people and looking at their minds and how they react on a subconscious level and in terms of their body biologically to manipulation and advertising. And so that's one form. Other people have talked about propaganda as lies and bald-faced omissions from government leaders, right? They've looked at it as just simply the manipulation of fear and emotion. They've looked at it as nationalism and the ways in which that promotes arrogance and fear. The way parties use propaganda to selectively socialize people in a narrow way in terms of that party's ideology. I've even heard people talk about entertainment, sports, video games as a form of diversion. That's propaganda because it diverts people from substantive political and social issues. So there's lots of different ways to understand how propaganda works. I think it all has to do at its core with this idea of manipulation. And it has to be done subconsciously for it to be really effective, because if people are aware that it's propaganda, it's not going to work.
Right. And so this was one of the cases with, like, I don't know which fast food restaurant it was, but basically in the cleaner that they used to mop the floor, there was faint aroma of beef flavored aroma. And they said, okay, it has to be just so mild, like just if it's too strong, their conscious mind will realize it's what it is and go, gross. But if it's just subtle and it passes right past the conscious to the subconscious, then it works. And people are biologically they'll get hungry from fucking mop water.
Yeah, I mean, this is Edward Bernays' big contribution, that he was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. And Freud was very interested in how, like, subconscious impulses and emotions could motivate people. So you gave an example of something could be operating on a subconscious level, appealing to your almost animalistic instinct, like food, flavors, right? And people need to eat to live, right? And so this is a basic, almost animalistic. It is animalistic because, animals have to eat too, right? But also a human need. And so, Bernays realized that he could popularize his uncle's work, and he could use this idea of manipulating people's subconscious in various ways to sell stuff. But the key was that you wouldn't tell people what you were doing. You would just make associations in their brain. So maybe they smell nasty mop water that smells like beef, and then they think about buying food and eat it. Maybe you sell, as Bernays did, cigarettes and market them to women as a sign of liberation during the women's rights movement in the 19-teens, right? And you don't say that it's about independence, but you have these like women who are attractive debutantes going in the Easter parade, waving around their cigarettes, calling them torches of liberty. And people think, wow, they associate it, right, with feminism and women's empowerment. And everybody wants to be empowered, right?
Yeah.
Like these are the kind of things that propagandists will look at subconsciously to manipulate. Like, you need food. People are attracted to sex. It's an animalistic impulse, right? The need to be social with others, which means to be respected. And that's where independence comes in and freedom, right? And so they know that you can take these basic human impulses and you can associate them with products that people don't actually need. They want products, right? For the most part. But they might think that they subconsciously need these things if it's tied to a basic impulse or need, psychologically and biologically.
So we have things like food and connectivity with other humans and the necessities, but done up in this kind of capitalistic way.
Sure. Comedy. People want to laugh. It's stress relief, right? People need that. It's a humanistic impulse. Action, violence is exciting. That's another human impulse, right? They appeal to these impulses.
So you touched on something really important before, which was entertainment and movies. Is there a history of propaganda in the movie industry?
Sure. I mean, there have been all types of efforts. If you look back, particularly during wartime, the Frank Capra movies during World War II, Why We Fight. This was a very blatant effort to mobilize people based upon the idea of propagandizing people for war. It hasn't stopped. There have been entire books written about how in modern times, anybody who wants to make a movie having to do with war or the military, they have to go to the Pentagon and they have to get the Pentagon to sign off on the script, right?
Really?
And they get to make edits. And otherwise, if you don't do that, they're not giving you access to the hardware, right? And this has been like a thing that's been going on for decades, that Hollywood has gotten brought in to a propaganda scheme. And this is just one example with war. There are others, of course, but probably one of the most blatant examples.
And it would be in their best interest, of course, any form of communication that's coming out of, let's say, just the U.S., it's in the best interest of whoever you'd say, the CIA or whoever's in charge, to make sure that everything has the correct perspective.
That's their job. Their job is in the military to do, a big part of it at least, is to do PR, right, for the government and to sell themselves. Yeah, so that's been something they've been concerned with for a very long time. And it's not new to modern times. There have been entire books written about the McCarthyist era, the Cold War, and how president after president would bring in like the Ad Council and other propaganda groups. They had their own groups like the Office for War Information. It sounds nice, right? The Office for War Information.
It's real benign. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you're a fan of George Carlin, but he definitely makes fun of the way that we soften speech to make certain things sound less horrible than they are. Correctional institution. Like, it's a fucking prison.
We have the euphemisms, propaganda. I mean, that's a big part of propaganda. If you want to sort of sell something, right? Using soft words to misdirect people's attention from critical ways of looking at it. Yeah.
So then I absolutely have to ask you about what's going on right now, because you're talking to me right now. I'm in Germany. And not too far away, there's like a huge war going on, and there's nuclear talk on the horizon. What's your consensus briefly on the current nuclear apocalypse scenario?
Well, there has been quite a bit of amount of coverage of that in the United States. It's looked at Putin and his comments about maybe considering using tactical nuclear weapons. I have to say, I mean, in general, this is something that's hard to sort of deal with from the point of view of someone who studies propaganda, because U.S. leaders are really good at demonizing other leaders who do questionable things, like talking about using nuclear weapons, invading other countries. And I don't have a problem with criticizing or condemning anybody who violates international law, as clearly happened in this case. But the U.S. has always been very selective, and it's those standards for other people, right? We don't follow any of that. We invade countries, Panama, Iraq, and without a second thought, right? And it's totally criminal. And And we don't have any problem with that. We're the only country that's ever used nuclear weapons on another country. And we talk about other countries as not being responsible enough to have nuclear weapons. So the outrage is very selective. And that's sort of the essence of a lot of propaganda, is lying through omission, right? Like, you look very hypercritically through your lens at other countries. And this is part of nationalism. But you don't have that same kind of critical standard for yourself.
Yeah, and I wanted to just give you the free pass because I believe human rights is a term that we use as a club to beat over the heads of the countries that we want something from, rather than, saying, yeah, but what about Saudi Arabia? That's your friend. Oh, no, he's cool. Or Israel. Oh, he's cool. Like, come on, a little consistency.
Sure. Yeah, I've researched this very closely, and I've documented it with numbers that the human rights have been politicized routinely in U.S. political discourse, where it's a weapon you use against countries you don't like. You talk about human rights, like Bashar Assad in Syria, or Vladimir Putin and how he treats gay people, and what he's doing in the Ukraine. But U.S. allies get a pass. What is Saudi Arabia doing in Yemen, in the civil war intervention there, where they have sanctioned the country, and it's led to mass death in the form of more than 100,000 people killed. We just don't hear about this stuff, right? Because it's the wrong kinds of human rights atrocities. It's the ones that are being done by the U.S. or its allies, right? And so that kind of selectivity is sort of the heart of a propaganda system when we talk about lies of omission, right? Very selective outrage and just totally leaving yourself out of the equation.
Yeah. I would like to think that there is a country out there that doesn't have to go to those extremes to control its population. But every attempt to organize society via politics, it necessitates you kind of manipulate the people into one common goal and one common idea. And that as its base, I'm just like, I'm an anarchist. I don't like that. I want to be autonomous. Thank you.
Sure.
But
that's a function of nationalism, right? I mean, nationalism creates borders and distinctions, and it lends itself to an us and them mentality, which is sort of ripe territory for propaganda.
Yeah,
for political leaders.
Yeah. Well, and the United States is very famous for it, and they've been doing it a long time. Is there another country that ranks high on, obviously Germany and stuff like this? Are there some surprising countries that have done some stuff that you think, wow? Or is it just the West?
Well, in terms of propaganda studies, I think that, the way I've understood it historically is that the U.S. was really at the forefront of propaganda studies historically. In terms of, number one, the practitioners, the Edward Bernays of the world, who were learning how to effectively do it, and then it morphing into this massive PR industry that at its core is based on propaganda because it manipulates emotions. And so what country can you find that has that equivalent where, over a period of just a few years, hundreds of billions of dollars get spent on mass advertising to create wants in people's minds that they otherwise wouldn't have? Because this is an important point. Why would you need to spend the hundreds of billions of dollars if people naturally wanted the stuff? You would just sell the stuff, right? And so they're creating wants here, and nobody does this like the United States. This is the biggest market in terms of mass consumerism and disposable dollars that we've seen historically in modern times. So it's not that other countries don't practice propaganda, but when people look at Russia and RT, let's say, or Saudi Arabia and Al Arabiya, China, the government of China is an authoritarian government. Like these entities practice propaganda, right? But it's much more effective, I would argue, in the United States because there is a pretense of democratic empowerment, and it makes it hard for people to see the propaganda, whereas in these other countries, it's very obvious that the government is telling people what to think, right?
So there is an excellent point. Excellent point. I want to drive this home that in China, at least they know that their government is authoritarian. In America, we have the illusion of choice. And this is worse. This adds a whole layer of mental illness, I think, on top of already what we're going through financially or whatever is going on right now. But and we are at the same time we're at odds with China right now. We're constantly saying that they're bad and they do this and they do that, but they're not actively invading other countries or other sovereign nations. there's this talk about debt traps and stuff, but then they turn around and said, well, we're forgiving loans for this African bridge or something that they did. They built some infrastructure and they said, well, we're actually not even doing that. So we can't believe everything we read, I guess, is the main point. But yeah, it's so great to have you because I have so many questions about these things. Let's see. So fascism is happening right now in America. It's pretty bad. Is it going to get worse? And what are some symptoms that we should be watching for? And what are some ways that we can do something about it?
This is a really good question. It's the elephant in the living room because there's so much denialism about fascistic politics and the rise of fascist ideology. I chalk that up to the problem of failed education. I don't think that people have really spent enough time studying historic fascism, so they have a really hard time seeing the parallels with a lot of developments today. I teach a class on right-wing extremism where we talk about the elements of fascism. And so people within an educational setting, they learn about the Nazi Germany and what were the elements of fascism in Mussolini's Italy and how they may overlap with today. So, in terms of the symptoms, the point that you brought up, I talk about in my book that, there's a few major sort of red flags that fascism scholars have documented throughout history, looking back to early fascism of the 20th century. And if you start seeing these things today, watch out. It includes things like white nationalism, which has become very prominent in the Republican Party under Trump onward. The idea of a mass hysteria with a cult of personality, where there's that one person people look to, and it's almost always a man. So it's a patriarchal cult of personality. There's the idea of a rising sort of romanticization of militarism and vigilantism, which we see with the Kyle Rittenhouses of the world, the Proud Boys of the world storming the Capitol and people making excuses for them. So the paramilitarism stuff is scary. It's not as big now as it was with the brown shirts, let's say, which numbered in the hundreds of thousands or millions. But if you look at modern American polls, something like 20% of Republicans say it would be a really good idea to use violence to get what you want. This is like this is millions of people who are latent fascists who say this stuff. So it is there. It's just, it may not have sort of totally, institutionalized itself to this point. What else? Eliminationism, the idea that you have one party and one group of people who are fit to rule and they want to sort of wipe out their opposition. This is something with QAnon and Donald Trump. He's now openly associating with them. And QAnon is straight up eliminationist. They have a very specific ideology that says that we should be executing the Democrats, right?
Good.
Or at least putting them in prisons. So that's a big part of this. And also militarism. This is something the U.S. has excelled at historically, but it was a big part of traditional fascism. So when you look at these different parts of classical fascism, it's really hard not to sort of notice parallels and overlaps today, even if the U.S. is not some kind of fully consolidated fascist republic yet. There's enough warning signs that we should be paying attention. And so I think that the way that we are going to deal with this is that, number one, people have to be active. People should be active right now, calling their members of Congress, demanding that Donald Trump be facing legal accountability for stoking an insurrection, for violating national security law, for what he did on January 6th in terms of stoking those people who marched on the Capitol and ransacked it, right?
Yeah.
So there's immediate stuff that we could be doing in terms of pressuring political leaders to have accountability for people who try to violate the law. And he's going to do it again in 2024. He's been very clear about, with his election propaganda, that he's trying to set the stage for a similar thing in the next election, where if he can get enough of these state leaders to sort of claim in positions of power, like secretaries of state, for example, that there was voter fraud, they might ignore a popular majority. And so this is a very real concern in the U.S. that there could be another coup attempt. And so these are the kind of things that we have to deal with in the short term in terms of a rising fascist threat. And in the long term, we need to start valuing education again. People need to know what fascism is and was so that they can identify it better. Because otherwise, it's just an abstraction. It's just a term. And people don't really know these histories because we don't stress them.
You think these are just terms that people are throwing around, especially socialism. People go, oh, I don't know what it is, but it's bad.
Oh, exactly. I was looking at some polling today on what socialism is, and you have half of young people who say they like socialism in America. And then you ask them what it is, and they say, Maybe it's like welfare programs. Maybe it's people being social. That's actually one of the answers. Socialism is people being social. And so, it's interesting that, 38% of Americans say they like socialism, but what does that actually mean? Like the most common answer people gave is that we respect equal rights. It's like, no, that's the 14th Amendment. We have that already. That's not socialism. Yes, maybe socialism suggests equality, but what does that mean exactly, right? And so socialism is not just a synonym for equality, and it doesn't mean being social.
And I think you got to be careful too, because socialism was popular 100 years ago, and then the Nazis took the word socialist, even though they were not socialist whatsoever, and just threw it in the name to say we're nationalist socialists.
They were trying to cultivate support from labor voters, right? And you can manipulate the meaning of things, and that's a big problem. So it's interesting when people say they like socialism, but what does it actually mean? I was able to look at that poll, and it was like, okay, maybe you mean authoritarian socialism, like the Soviet Union kind, where government controls everything. That was probably the second most popular answer people gave. But if you wanted actually like citizen-based socialism, where people control their communities and workplaces, there's a name for this. It's called cooperatives. Yeah. Communes, cooperatives. Only 1% of Americans cited cooperatives in the workplace as what socialism actually is. And that's really probably the best definition of it.
That's the best selling point of it, is saying, how would you like to get rid of your boss and just have all your coworkers run everything? They're like, sounds okay. Like that.
Yeah. And people don't know that that's what socialism is. They think it means being social, or some generic sort of discussion of equality or something.
It means being social. Okay. All right. Yeah. So education is a big, big deal if we're going to put out this fucking big fascist fire that we've got started. But other than that, it's like a mental illness issue too. People have to really come back to earth as far as some of the fanatical fantasies that they've started to believe in, as far as QAnon and all this other stuff. But it seems to me that conspiracy theories have always been, and economic downturn are the two like main starters for fascism.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the United States and the rise of neo-fascistic politics today, I certainly talk in my book about how the Democratic Party had, for decades, failed working class people. It had supported free trade agreements that led to massive amounts of deindustrialization and really harmed working class communities. And what ended up happening is that large numbers of people left the Democratic Party. The largest share of these people became non-voters, right? And so that created a vacuum. It created a vacuum where you have the traditional base of the Republican Party, which is increasingly fascist in terms of embracing QAnon and eliminationism. And their base historically is like middle income to middle upper income individuals, and quite a few wealthy people too, right? It skews affluence, in other words. Middle income, middle upper income, and upper income, right? And so those people will turn out no matter what. They see themselves as empowered, as affluent, as efficacious, and they're always going to vote, even in primaries. And what happened with the Democratic Party is they just really failed working class people, and they didn't represent them. And many of these people just checked out of politics. And so in that vacuum, the Republican Party has really been able to sort of surge forward and become more competitive than it otherwise would be, and have this sort of Trumpian movement that has ascended in the last half decade.
And in addition to that, they're utilizing these bots or troll networks where they're swaying people's opinions. Like we saw with Cambridge Analytica, what they harvested a bunch of data. They could analyze who was on the fence and give them a nudge in some direction by feeding them just, enough ads in enough places. And is this a major concern? As people, these fake conversations and fake,
I think so. I mean, I remember when the Reopen movement came about. Remember Reopen during COVID? Mm-hmm. And it was the portrayal of like grassroots empowerment. And then it came out, there was some research that like half of the Reopen memes that were on social media were bots. They weren't even real people. They were bots. And So I think that sometimes people spend too much time talking about this in a limited capacity. Like we spent years talking about how Russia was destroying America. Yeah, well, they certainly did try to manipulate an election, right? So, but it wasn't just them. Like the idea of malicious actors in the social media ecosphere is a really big concern because, this is just fundamentally different than traditional media. When you have a traditional news outlet, whether it be CNN or the New York Times or the BBC or whatever, they have gatekeepers, right? They filter information and they have fact checkers. They may not do a great job all the time. They may fall victim to government propaganda and the propaganda of the powerful, sure. They may have their own financial interests and profits and consumerism, sure. There's all types of questions there. But, relative to some of the stuff we're seeing on social media, relative to that, it almost looks good by comparison when you talk about venues that are serving as hotbeds for election fraud propaganda, for QAnon, for birtherist propaganda about Obama and his citizenship, which was a previous iteration of this conspiracy stuff, COVID conspiracies, right? About how COVID was created in a bioweapons lab in China, despite lack of any actual concrete evidence being presented that has actually happened. And so we really are living in the Wild West of media with the rise of social media.
Yeah.
And so how do we fix that, right? Because these bots and other types of actors, influencers who are peddling in disinformation, they have been allowed largely free reign with the rise of these modern conspiracies. So this is a really big question we haven't figured out yet. Me personally, I am a big supporter of the idea of some kind of government regulation where I think that if people are increasingly flocking to social media, I don't think the answer is the government coming in and telling social media venues what they're going to allow them to print or not, because it would require an army of curators to do that. And I don't think that the companies themselves want to do it and the government wouldn't want to do it because there's billions of people using this stuff, right? Like, how would you ever curate all that content? I don't think that the way that you're going to fix it is by going post by post on Twitter and Facebook to do it. I think you need a set of rules to bring discourse up. So what our government needs to do, and I think what governments across the world need to be doing, is they need to be telling these venues like Facebook and Twitter, if you broke people's brains, then you need to fix them. And what you need to do is you need to fund real journalism, whether it's nonprofit or a company that you're partnering with, whether it's CNN or New York Times or whatever, or if it's nonprofit. And you need to saturate people with good information, whether it's one of every 5 posts. Well, why not? Like, one of every 5 posts is an ad. Why can't one of every 5 be a legitimate news story and saturate people with good information to actually fight back against some of this? And I don't think that these companies want to do that because it's not within their financial bottom line to spend money on something that doesn't bring back a return. But in terms of good citizenship and good governance and having societies where people aren't poisoned by misinformation, we have to start taking seriously this idea of regulation. And we can do it, particularly in the United States. These venues have argued for a long time that they're not journalists and they're not news corporations. So they are not subject to the kind of First Amendment protections that they otherwise would be. So they can be regulated as private companies that are providing this kind of privatized utility people use to disseminate information. Mm-hmm. There's got to be some ground rules, I think, or otherwise you get the QAnons of the world running around and stoking insanity and getting people up and fanatical. And
the QAnon thing is a more kind of like a religious fanatical kind of thing because it's a fantasy or a mythology of sorts. But we're talking about political actors and the idea that China built its own firewall where it said we don't want any outside influence. And to some degree, it is pretty intelligent because if we have a no borders information thing, then this illusion of control that a nation has over its people is non-existent because Russia can just keep trying and keep making Facebook accounts and keep trying to get to the people to get its message across that we need to. I hypothesize that in 20 years' time, there's going to be borders on all the internet, and you're going to need like a little digital passport in order to get information from one part to the other. The other thing is domestic people, like you say, like corporate interest, or whether it be like political parties who want to get their point across, will continue to do Cambridge Analytica style things, create troll armies, I have to say what you want to say about Fidel Castro. The guy had the newspaper in the socialist country, no advertisements, only health tips, stuff, useful stuff. And I got to say, I like that.
Well, I agree. I was just talking about this with my American politics students yesterday about how we fix this problem of rising misinformation. One of the big problems that the U.S. faces, the challenge, is that it doesn't have the kind of authoritarian powers under a federal system that like China does to just control information. So how do you sort of deal with this? And I think that one thing that my students really liked, and we talked about, is this idea that there should be a journalism out there that is provided on a nonprofit basis through taxpayer subsidies, where people have access to information as a human right. And so that would involve having a vibrant civil society-based public media system, sort of like the BBC or CBC. We don't really have that in the United States because PBS and NPR are so horrifically underfunded. But the idea of some kind of collective where people can get information, where it's based on actually providing news, and it's done in a nonprofit way where it's a public good and it's taxpayer funded. I think we do desperately need that, because we've really, particularly in the case of the United States, empowered these corporations to do whatever they want without any sort of social accountability. And with social media, you see that in its most extreme form. And we don't have any sort of notion of a collective responsibility. And we need to have that, I think.
So I want to wrap it up soon because we're just talking up a storm. You had mentioned in another interview about the consolidation of media. Can you give everybody out there maybe a brief history on how it was 50, 60, 70 years ago to where we're at now and why that might be not so nice?
Sure. If you go back to the late 1800s, early 20th century, it was very common in the late 1800s to see dozens of newspapers in any major city. And really, by the turn of the 20th century, that had changed. You saw the rise of monopoly capitalism. It affected newspapers, not just other industries, right, like steel or oil. And so what we've seen in the last 100 years, particularly the last 50 years, is the continued consolidation. Like research that's been done on this, Ben Bagdickian's a good source. He wrote a book called The Media Monopoly that's been updated many times. He talked about how, like, you may have had 2 to 3 dozen major corporations that controlled most of what people read, saw, or heard in the United States in the 1970s or 80s. And it was down to about a dozen by the turn of the 21st century. And so we're living in the era now where you've got a couple large corporations that control social media. You have about a dozen major corporations that control other types of media, between newspapers and television, telecommunication, and so on. And so it's not a monopoly, but it's an oligopoly, right? An oligopoly is the idea of a few companies that control most of what people read, see, hear, and consume. So we have the illusion of choice. We have a million different streaming services, right, and channels, but they're controlled by an ever smaller number of actual corporations. So I think the question now is, how we push back against that. And so some of these ideas about like a public media system and regulating social media, I think we have to take these things seriously if we want to have a healthier, vibrant democracy. And I think every country should be having these discussions too, with regard to corporate power and access to information.
Was there a revolution earlier in the 20th century when newspapers became a little bit too monopolized and stuff? Have we already been through this to some degree?
Sure. The answer from these newspapers and the editors was objectivity. Objectivity was not a new idea in 1900 to 1915 when all these journalism schools were being created to socialize people to be objective as journalists. It wasn't an idea whose time had just come. It was a necessity because people wouldn't tolerate one newspaper in each major market that was blatantly partisan, because the previous newspapers, there may have been dozens, they were overwhelmingly partisan. There were a lot of choices, but they were each individually very partisan. So what these corporations did is they came up with objectivity. They said, oh, yeah, well, if we report what Democrats and Republicans are saying simultaneously, then everybody can buy the paper, right? Now, there was a very sort of narrow thinking there that you could maintain a monopoly with objectivity. But there's also positives that come along with it, too. The idea with objectivity is something that's defensible. The idea that you try to give people an accurate understanding of what's going on in the world and report different points of view to do it. I think that's something worth defending, even if these companies were very self-serving in trying to do it. So, I think I'm very much in favor of challenging corporate power when it comes to media, but also defending ideas like objectivity, which I think are important.
Yeah, but at the same time, the corporate interests themselves, when they start consolidating these media outlets, their main goal is to monopolize them and then create them to be a rag with one specific viewpoint. And this is where we're at with Fox News, and then CNN since then has followed suit.
Sure.
But there was a deregulation event that made this happen. Do you know what it was?
Well, we used to have a fairness doctrine. That was probably the biggest legal change in the United States, where that goes back to the Great Depression era. The FCC and Congress had acted to say that anyone who gets a public license, whether it's television or radio, has to make an effort to provide for different points of view. And that was abandoned by Congress. And it was abandoned by the Reagan administration and the FCC in the 1980s. And then it was formally abandoned by Congress in the 2010s. And that's how you can get a company like Fox News or MSNBC that are so shameless in just doing partisan propaganda. Because we live in a very weird hybrid era now. Like, you've got these partisan media, but you still have these objective media too. And these companies are more than happy to make money off of party propaganda if you let them, right? Without regulation, they are unleashed to do this. And Fox News is probably the most egregious example. Really quickly before I leave, I don't know if you saw this, but Tucker Carlson was sued. He was sued by this Playboy model, Karen McDougal, because he had suggested that she was paid off by Donald Trump. There was some kind of settlement with regards to allegations of sexual infidelity, that he cheated on his wife, right? And so, Tucker Carlson was suggesting that she was some kind of prostitute who was paid off. So she sues him in court and under, slander, that you lied about somebody and you hurt their reputation, and she sued for damages. The court dismissed the case. And you know why they dismissed it?
Tell me.
The lawyers for Fox argued in court that you shouldn't take anything seriously at Fox because it's entertainment, right? It's all a joke. It's not serious. They're not real journalists. And the court agreed. They said, "Oh, it's not real news. Any rational person would know that Fox News shouldn't be taken seriously as a news source." And this is the kind of stuff you get in the modern era when you have a situation where someone can call themselves Fox News, right? And then they can argue in court that they're not news, that they're some kind of tabloid garbage format. And people watch this stuff and they think it's real. And, if the government doesn't regulate that and say, hey, there's a disclaimer here. You guys said you're not news. You have to advertise that. I mean, there would be some real accountability there if they had to do that.
If you have something that's got news in the title, but you'd go to court and they say, "Oh no, everybody should know it's not new." That's a symptom of the decline of Western civilization. You are toast.
Most truth.
And I will say this: McDonald's, this Super Size Me documentary came out in the early 2000s, and the same thing happened. Two fat girls they went to court and sued McDonald's because their food made them fat, and because they couldn't really prove it. It was a hard case, and the judge ended up throwing it out. But they said in court, the lawyers for McDonald's said, everyone should already know that McDonald's food is not good for you.
And they're at the same time that they're advertising professional athletes eating this stuff as if it's compatible with a healthy lifestyle, right? Yeah. Talk about manipulation.
Or growing up with the cereal commercials, right? It's like part of a balanced breakfast.
Right. Is eating sugar cereal.
Bullshit, man. All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Obviously, we're going to have Professor Anthony DiMaggio back because he's so much fun. He's a punk, turns out, just like me. We'll have him back. Pick up his book. It's Rising Fascism in America. It Can Happen Here. It is happening here. He's got tons of other books. You can check him out on Counterpunch, which is where he writes. Amazing human being. Great conversation. Thanks for stopping by, man.
Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah.